So let's talk about the structure of scientific papers. This is the way scientific findings are reported, and a scientific paper has a very rigid organization that is not necessarily that intuitive, certainly not when you're trying to write it. So you see the major categories here, the major sections of the scientific paper: the introduction, materials and methods, results, discussion, and references, or sometimes that's called literature cited. There are some other sections that are left out that are important when you're writing. The title is a very important thing. We're not going to really talk about that, but trying to have a concise title that really describes what the paper is about is really important so that people can find the paper when they're interested in that topic. There's a special way that the authors are listed as well as their academic affiliations. The abstract is essentially a summary of the paper, and again, that's an important part because a lot of papers will be mostly just the only part that will be read will be the abstract. And then acknowledgments is another section that is usually in a scientific paper where contributions of people that are not authors are acknowledged. So scientific papers are put together in the order that you see just because it makes the most sense in terms of extracting information from the paper. The problem is that, especially when you're writing the paper, this order is not necessarily chronological, and so it's not the most obvious structure that you can have, but it has been well established and there are good reasons for it. When somebody is going to read more of a paper than just the abstract, they'll often look through the introduction, skim the results, and look through the discussion sections. And again, that's just because those are the most readable parts of the paper, but they're actually not necessarily the most important parts, or at least not all the most important parts. So in the introduction, you want to outline the nature and scope of the problem that you're reporting on. And in doing that, you need to review all the pertinent literature that's out there that has to do with that problem. You're also trying to give a very brief methodology of what you did. You're certainly not giving all the details, but you're giving just a brief outline of how you approach the problem, and then what the principal findings and conclusions were. Again, just a very, very brief way. In the materials and methods, this is where you give all of the details about what you did, and you have to give enough detail about what you did that a competent researcher could replicate the work. If there isn't enough information in the materials and methods to replicate the work, it's really not science, and it really doesn't have very much value. In the results section, you summarize the findings of the study and provide whatever figures and tables are necessary to display those results as clearly as possible. Figures, by the way, are often graphs. They're not necessarily graphs, but they're often graphs. The two most important sections of the scientific paper are the methods and the results, because those are the sections that are real. Those are not interpretations of results. That's what actually happened. This is what you did, and this is what you found when you did it. So those really are the two most important parts of the paper. As I said, often they are not going to be the two most read parts of the paper, especially the methods section. And even the results are often not really read in detail by most of the people that read a scientific paper. Usually it'll be the graphs, so the figures and tables that are looked at rather than the actual text read. So that's the key part of the paper. You can have a paper with very legitimate methods and results, and the results are completely misinterpreted in the discussion section. But like I say, the methods and the results, that's the heart of the paper, that's the key part. When it comes to writing a paper, often the results section is written first. Sometimes the introduction is at least partially written first, just because that's often, if you're writing a grant proposal, often the reason that you're doing the study is pretty much going to be similar to what the introduction section is going to be. But when it comes to actually writing a paper, often you start with the results section. And in the results section, usually you're starting with the figures and tables, the graphs and the tables that you need to most clearly show the results of the work. And so you have to do the statistical analysis and create your graphs and your tables. All the data that you wind up mentioning in the discussion section has to be in the results. You can't talk about data that you have, but that you didn't put in the results. That's not legitimate. That'll be flagged by editors and won't be allowed to be published in that form. And you also can't add data in the results section that is not mentioned in the discussion section. So you can't have graphs in the results section that you can talk about in the discussion section. If it's not worth talking about in the discussion, then why is it in the paper? You shouldn't have it in the paper at all. And I have seen manuscripts where people have done that, where data is presented in the results section and then it's never mentioned in the discussion, and that gets flagged when I'm reviewing paper. That gets flagged and it gets taken out, has to be rewritten. The results section can be surprisingly difficult to write because, well, and the whole problem with the scientific paper is that these sections are pretty rigidly defined, and sometimes it feels unnatural to just keep the right information in each section. So in the results section, you do not discuss why or how the experiment was performed. Why the experiment was done is in the introduction. How the experiment was performed is in the methods section. That's information does not belong in the results. There are places for it in the paper, but the results section is not where that goes. You don't include any raw data in the results section. This is processed data. This is data that you've actually already analyzed that gets presented here. These days, often with scientific papers, raw data is included. It's not actually in the paper, but it'll be on the publisher's website. It'll be ancillary material, so you can go online and you can pull up the raw data set, and that way other researchers can go through it and analyze it and make sure that they're getting the same results that the authors did. But it's not actually in the paper. In the results section, you also do not interpret the results, which is you have a natural tendency to want to do that as you're presenting them, to talk about their significance and what they mean. That doesn't happen in the results section. That happens in the discussion. There's a place for that, but it's not in the results section. You also don't report on what you expected to happen, at least not in the results section. Again, you might discuss that in the discussion section, especially if it's a surprising result that wasn't expected or that other authors didn't find. Then certainly you would bring that up and talk about it in the discussion. You also don't critique your results. You don't talk about weaknesses in the results section. You might do that in the discussion section. So the discussion section is obviously important. The content of the discussion section is probably less well defined than in any of the other sections of a scientific paper. You have more freedom to put things in the discussion section than you do in other sections of the paper. In the discussion section, what you're basically doing is discussing the results. You're not recapitulating them because the results are already reported in the results section, but you're discussing what they mean. How do the results and your interpretations agree or disagree with previously published work? That's something that you would talk about in the discussion section. What are the theoretical implications of this work and of your results? What are the conclusions that you're coming to, and what's just a brief summary of the evidence for each conclusion? Those are the sorts of things that would be in the discussion section. The references are a really important part of the scientific paper, but again, most people are not going to read them. It's not the sort of thing you really read through. But it's important because if it's a topic that someone's interested in, they want to know what other sources you're talking about. And especially when you're starting out looking up a new topic, if you find a good paper, the reference section is really valuable to you because it gives you all the background citations for other studies that have been done on that topic. So it's really important. Again, even though probably the majority of people that read any given scientific paper are not really going to care about the reference section. And the references are interesting in scientific paper because the way that they work is basically the same as hypertext, where you have text on the World Wide Web, and you can click on a section of text and it'll take you to some other area and talk about something specific that was referred to in the text. And that's the way references work, even though they've been around long before the internet has been around. They're sort of a manual hyperlink. So every citation that's in the paper must appear in the reference section. And like I said, sometimes the reference section is called literature cited, but it's the same thing. So every citation that's in that is in the text of the paper has to be also listed in the reference section. All the citations that are in the reference section must also appear in the paper. You can't just have a bunch of citations listed in the reference section that you have not referred to in the paper. There has to be a complete one-to-one linking between citations in the written part of the paper and the references that are listed in the literature cited section. There's a big problem when it comes to where a paper is being submitted because every journal has a different format for their references. And you really have to follow the exact format for a journal. So that means that if you submit a paper to one journal and it gets rejected, and you decide, well, I'm going to submit it to this other journal, which happens all the time, you're going to have to go through and change the format of the reference section to match the new journal because basically every journal is different. There are details that are different. Now, one of the issues that comes up, and people do this, and this actually does often make it through reviewers so that the papers get published this way, where it's very easy to kind of look through an abstract for a paper, and from the abstract, you assume that the paper has reached some conclusion that it may not really have reached if you actually read the paper. And so you use that paper as a reference to support that idea, and then somebody comes along and reads your paper and looks up that paper and realizes, well, it doesn't really support the statement that you said it supported. So it's very important that you check all the parts of every reference before you refer to it. You can't just read the abstract and assume that that paper says what you think it says from the abstract. You also want to be careful about making sure that you're not just dumping tons and tons of references into a paper, because you really want only the important ones, only ones that are significant, and really only the published ones. Once in a while you will see a lot of government publications are not really quite officially published. There are agency publications and agency bulletins and agency reports and those sorts of things. That's called gray literature, and sometimes those will get cited. And once in a while, you will also have a reference that it'll just say, somebody's name, and after that it'll say PERS.com, which is an abbreviation for personal communication. That means somebody just told the author something. I saw a Sasquatch in the woods behind my house last Wednesday or something. And so those are the weakest references possible. Once in a while they're in there, but if it's any important point, nobody's going to be impressed with a personal communication reference.